Well, good morning to all my friends, and especially some of our friends in Sweden who are joining us today. A huge welcome to you. Välkommen. I'm thrilled to be introducing you to the Cape Floral Kingdom and some of its very exciting gardens in our part of the world. And I just wanted to say that I hope you will consider this not so much a lecture as a trip. And gosh, we all need more of those in lockdown. For our Swedish friends who are still experiencing the dark and cold winter, and Marie's just shown us the frozen lake behind her, this may be a lovely diversion. And to my Cape Town friends, this talk will remind you of what you already know. Please consider it a refresher course. I confess I'm not a horticulturalist, but I am a keen gardener, and above all, I love gardens. So I ask you to join me on this trip to a most wonderful part of the world in which I am lucky enough to live. This is Cape Town, known as the mother city of the Rainbow Nation, famous for its beaches, its sensational beauty, its nature, its diversity, its sunshine. And by the way, we average more than 8 hours of sunlight per day. And of course, our iconic Table Mountain. The slopes of Table Mountain have a variety of posh neighborhoods, from Constantia to Tamboerskloof, and one's view and the value of your real estate is almost always defined by whether or not you can see Table Mountain. I live in the southern suburbs and close to this beach in Simonstown, which is famous for its penguin colony, sadly shrinking due to fewer fish to eat. In addition to stunning landscapes, our wildlife is dramatic and sometimes noisy. The cat on the right is a caracal, and yes, they have been spotted in my neighborhood. You may think this is the Amalfi Coast, but it is actually Chapman's Peak Drive, one of the most beautiful and scenic drives anywhere, and just minutes from our house. I have been extremely lucky to live in two kingdoms in my life, the United Kingdom and now the Cape Floral Kingdom. As I'm sure you are aware, botanists have divided the world into 6 floral regions or kingdoms. 5 of the regions are the size of continents, but one small part of one country is so rich and diverse in plant species that it was declared the 6th region. And this is the Cape Floral region, and it is the smallest of the 6 floral kingdoms of the world. This puts the size of the Cape Floral Kingdom into perspective. We are that small red tip at the southern end of Africa, and that is the region in which many watching today live. The famous Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus described the Cape Floral Kingdom as this heaven on earth. And UK botanist Ronald Good said that, quote, the Cape region is also special interest because it has contributed much to the beauty of European gardens. And I would also add those of North America as well. Just to zero in, this close-up of the southernmost part of South Africa will help you understand how small the Cape Floral Kingdom is. The distance between Cape Town and Port Elizabeth is about a 10-hour drive. That little crooked finger that you see just under the black dot, which is Cape Town, is where I live, many of us live, at the bottom of that hook. The Cape Floral Kingdom comprises 8 protected areas stretching from the Cape Peninsula to the Eastern Cape, cutting across spectacular mountain and ocean scenery and containing some of the richest plant biodiversity in the world. Of the 9,000 plant species found in the Cape Floral Kingdom, the majority are fynbos plants. According to the World Wildlife Fund, when you first look across an expanse of fynbos, you may not at first be impressed. But when you look a bit closer, you will see that the sheer diversity of these numerous species is staggering. I'm going to be more precise about fynbos in a minute. UNESCO's World Heritage Committee declared the 1,370,000 acre Cape Floral Kingdom to be of, quote, outstanding universal significance to humanity, describing it as one of the richest areas for plants in the world. While it represents less than 0.5% of the area of Africa, it is home to nearly 20% of the continent's flora, according to UNESCO. Its plant species diversity, density, and endemism are among the highest worldwide, and it has been identified as one of the world's 18 biodiversity hotspots. Of our 9,000 vascular plant species, 69% are endemic, which means that they are native to this area. It is home to the greatest non-tropical concentration of higher plant species in the world. And the Cape Floristic region is located entirely within the borders of South Africa. 8 of the protected areas of the Cape Floral Kingdom, one of the 8 protected areas is Table Mountain. And at the foot of Table Mountain is our world famous Kirsten Bosch Botanical Garden. This is the first time a botanical garden has been included in one of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites. I'm sure many of you watching today have been to this extraordinary garden. It is really worthy of its own Zoom presentation. Much of this diversity is associated with the fynbos biome, a Mediterranean type fire-prone shrubland. The name fynbos originates from an old Dutch word meaning fine bush. It refers not to one, but all of the plants associated with the mountains of South Africa's Cape region. It's like saying tropical forest or savanna, a vegetation type, in other words. These mountains, made of ancient weather-beaten sandstone, extend from the Western Cape's Stellenberg Range, a 3-hour drive north Cape Town, to the mountains of Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape, which is about a 2-day drive away. This area is predominantly coastal and mountainous with a Mediterranean climate. So we have very hot summers and very rainy winters. Despite our diversity, there is a dark side to all of this, which is that most of the fynbos is extremely rare and in danger of dying out completely. Something like 1,700 fynbos plants are threatened with extinction, which is another reason why fynbos live within a UNESCO World Heritage Site with nature reserves to protect it. This plant is our beautiful and plentiful yellow pincushion or leucospernum, a member of the Protea family. As I've said, the diversity is staggering. Of the 9,000 species of plants occurring in the area, around 6,200 are endemic, occurring nowhere else in the world. Thus, although the fynbos comprises only 6% of the area of southern Africa, it has half the species on the subcontinent, and in fact, has almost 1 in 5 of all African plant species so far described. To put the plant diversity into perspective, Table Mountain alone hosts as many plant species as the United Kingdom, all 2,200 species of them. This is what makes the Western Cape more botanically diverse than the richest tropical rainforest in South America, and that includes the Amazon. South Africa's national flower, the king protea, is perhaps the most famous species of fynbos. Interestingly, many fynbos plants depend on fire for their survival, some needing the heat for their seeds to germinate. But I'm going to come back to the importance of fire a little later on. This stunning picture was taken by our president, Amanda Osorio, who was hiking and only saw this last month.
Thanks.
Fynbos appears unimpressive from a distance. It is treeless, scrubby, and brown. Fine bush in the sense of thin, straggly, and not very productive. It grows and thrives in nutrient deficient soil or acid sand under very tough climatic conditions. On closer inspection, feignboss reveals itself to be a mesmerizing mosaic of plants bursting with flowers every month of the year. Although feignboss has a plethora of plant species, there are three which particularly stand out. Our Protea family, the reed family or restios, and the heath family of ericas. It is these three species we're going to concentrate on, and all three are found in cultivated gardens as well as in the wild. Of course, our most famous plant is the Protea, which grows spectacularly in the wild, but is also cultivated in gardens as well as for markets abroad. Protea are among the oldest families of flowers on Earth, dating back 300 million years. Greek legend tells us that Proteas were named after Proteus, the son of Poseidon. Proteus was defiant and preferred to nap on the island of Pharos rather than prophesize. To deter those seeking his insights, he would change his shape at will. And it's said that the Protea flower was named after him because it too presents itself in an astounding variety of shapes, sizes, hues, and textures. This is Protea signaroides, and it's being visited by a nectar-feeding bird known as a sugarbird. Proteas are visited as well by bees and beetles, but it is the birds that pollinate the flowers. As they feed on the nectar, their heads touch the pollen presenters and transfer pollen from flower to flower. Now, interestingly, Proteas don't live that long, about 13 years on average, according to a guide at Kirsten Bosch, who once told me that. There are many types of Protea, about 1,400 of them, and Protea do not like to be cared for. They require sun, but they do not like to be fertilized, and they prefer poor, well-drained soil. Now, here's an example of a Protea seen in many gardens. It's actually in my garden. So we're going to leave now the majestic Proteas and move to the next family, the Restios, or the Cape Reeds. And it's the Restios that really define the presence of feignboss. Restios are the lowest common denominator in feignboss. There may not be any Proteas or heathers or flashy orchids where you are, but there will always be a Restio of some kind. To a large extent, they take the place of grasses, and the more you see of them, the tougher the environment. Restios are a magnificent group of plants that are set to join grasses and bamboos as the new stars of the garden. They're an ancient plant family, probably dating back to the end of the Cretaceous period, some 60 million years ago. They are evergreen, perennial grass-like plants, which occur mainly in the southern hemisphere. This one is called a Legia Tectorum fishhook, so it's growing very close to where I live. Restios are architecturally stunning plants with a huge range of form and color, making them spectacular yet elegant feature plants, which are used where a vertical accent is needed. They will bring a variety of shapes, textures, and rich colors into your garden, ranging from a gorgeous golden brown to chocolate and bronze, gray-green, and silver. In a feignboss garden, these plants are water-wise and can form the backbone of the garden, in between the much shorter-lived Proteas and Ericas. Here are three examples of Restios from my garden, and they're all the same type. Now, when pruning Restios, one has to take out all the dead stalks one by one. And if you give it a chop, a haircut, and just take off the top 2/3, the plant is going to look a bit forlorn. Another interesting thing about Restios is that they are propagated by wind, which we have quite a lot of here in Cape Town. Now, the third predominant feignboss species are the ericas, beautiful plants that thrive in the Western Cape. If you are a walker or a climber, In the mountains of the Cape, you cannot help but be intrigued by the indigenous ericas growing in abundance here. Around 690 of the species are endemic to South Africa, and these are all often called the Cape heaths. Erica species are mainly calciphagous, which means they're limited to acidic or very acidic soils, which can range from dry and sandy to extremely wet ones, such as a bog. Yet they often dominate dwarf shrub habitats or the ground vegetation of open acidic woodland. The genus Erica is one of the largest in the Cape Peninsula, where 104 species occur. There are some 860 species of Erica in southern Africa, which makes it the largest genus in South Africa. What grows in the wild is so often the most dramatic example of our wonderful Cape flora. Here we have Erica palancei, their vibrant red flowers in autumn amongst a type of Protea, the leucadendron xanthoconus bushes in leaf in the foreground. And this picture is taken from the Kogelberg Mountains in the Western Cape. But feignboss is certainly not limited to just the Proteas, the Restios, or the Ericas. So I'm going to include a few of our more illustrious plants. Here's the blue Daisa, known by its Latin name as Daisa Gramonofolia, one of the many orchid species in feignboss. Indeed, a quarter of orchids in southern Africa are found on the Cape Peninsula. The picture on the right was taken by our president, Amanda. Thank you so much. This orchid is the famous red Daisa, the emblem of the Western Cape, and it's strictly protected. They tend to grow in hard to get to places, like at the top of Table Mountain. I have seen them once from a distance, and they apparently like trickling water to thrive. It's found along stream banks, waterfalls, or wet cliffs on Table Mountain and other mountain localities. I am also told that baboons love to eat them. So when you see a red Daisa, it is a memorable day. Here's another picture of the red Daisa, correctly known as Daisa uniflora. And this was taken a few weeks ago on top of Table Mountain by my friend Gail, who sent it to me. And she makes the trek up to the top of Table Mountain to see them every February. Red, the Valentine month. Now here's another iconic plant that features in every garden and in the wild very prominently, our lovely aloes. Winter and aloes are synonymous in South Africa, and as the days get shorter and crisper, the aloes start showing off their deep red blooms like a flame spreading across the horizon. The flowers typically appear in late winter to early spring with tall stems producing red-hued flower clusters. Most aloe flower varieties are rich in nectar, providing a much needed sugar rush for the bird species during the leaner winter months. And I don't know about all of you, but my aloes are just beginning to bloom. Aloe vera, the true or medicinal aloe, is indigenous to Africa, and it is abundant here in the Western and Eastern Cape. Aloe vera has around 250 species, of which 4 are grown for their health benefits. So are aloes part of feignboss? Well, some are apparently, such as the Aloe sucotrina, the feignboss aloe on the left, an aloe which is endemic to Cape Town and the southwestern corner of the Western Cape. It's one of the few aloes that naturally occur in feignboss habitats, along with the fan aloe seen in the middle, and Aloeum pelos commixta of Table Mountain on the right. In fact, this yellow aloe is known as the Table Mountain aloe. And aloes can grow to be enormous. This lady who appears to be visiting from Miami, oh, actually it's me. And this was taken last month in a garden area at my house. And I'm including it because of the 2 huge aloes on the left. Same aloes, different hat. Here I am in my garden taken just about a month ago. These two aloes have doubled in size in the past 5 years. When winter days are short and the weather is cold, aloes cannot fail to bring warmth to your garden with their spectacular blooms. They look particularly spectacular when planted en masse, and they're perfect for our dry climate. Their succulent leaves make them highly drought resistant, and they require minimal maintenance once established. There are so many amazing and bizarre plants here in the Western Cape. This is just one of them, called a candelabra lily, or Brunsvigia orientalis. And it only emerges for a few short weeks at the end of summer. It should be blooming right about now. And it's about as large as a soccer ball. It eventually dries out, and then the circular flower stalks literally are blown like windmills across the landscape, releasing their seeds as they go. Another flowering plant which blooms wild, as well as in gardens, is the Pelagonium, a genus of flowering plant which includes about 280 species of perennials, succulents, and shrubs, commonly known as geraniums or pelargoniums. Pelargoniums are indigenous to South Africa and are hardy, sun-loving perennials, virtually trouble-free to grow. They have been in cultivation since the early 1700s. And of the 280 or so wild species of Pelargonium, about 220 are native to South Africa. In addition to these wild species, many cultivars have been developed. Really, we have South Africa to thank for our lovely summer geraniums in the Northern Hemisphere. Although cultivars are popular in South Africa, indigenous species are also grown in many gardens. One of the more conspicuous examples is the showy and shrubby Pelagonium cuculatum, seen here. Scented pelargoniums grow easily, and there are dozens of different ones available, including lemon, apple, rose, and mint. The flowers are much smaller and more delicate than other types of pelargoniums, and they all tend to thrive in sunny positions and won't flower if kept in the shade. They need a well-drained soil and a mulching in summer. Now, sadly, fynbos is under threat due in no small part to agriculture, invading plant species, and human development. This is wild Agapanthus, or African lilies, and they are beautiful flowering perennials of South African origin, and they populate almost every garden here, as well as the medians of many motorways. One of the more critical elements to the propagation and success of fynbos is fire. This is an aerial view of the swath of destruction left by fire in March 2015 in a section of the Table Mountain National Park, taken just a month after our annual holiday in February. This is before we moved here full time. As we left for Britain, Cape Town started to burn, and this picture is only about 10 miles from where we live today. Now it is a lush green, covered in fynbos once again. Fire is key to the survival of fynbos. And that's because it's required to complete their life cycle. The flames burn accumulated dead plant material to recycle nutrients back into the impoverished soil. The intense heat opens tightly sealed seed cones, like for Proteas, and it triggers underground bulbs into growth. But it's more complex than that. The chemicals in fire, such as ammonia, act as stimulants for many Protea species to burst into leaf from their blackened stumps. It happens quickly too. Within a week of a fire, there are green shoots emerging from the charred sand. And after a few months, the landscape is awash with color as thousands of flowering plants take advantage of the new conditions, ironically making a post-fire environment the best time to see fynbos. Fynbos needs regular burning every 10 to 15 years. The smoke from these fires is particularly important as a stimulus that gets dormant seeds to germinate. Many annuals and bulbous species flower and seed just after these fires from where there is a high availability of nutrients and sunlight. Seeds may have lain dormant for decades until the next fire passes through. During one controlled burn in the De Hoop Nature Reserve, there was no record of the block having been burned in over 80 years. Immediately after the fire, species germinated that were either new to science or had lain dormant underground for the entire 80 years, which is utterly amazing and shows the incredible persistence of fynbos. Fire is an inevitable and necessary factor, and it ensures optimal regeneration. And when the dense canopy is removed, there is sufficient space and light to stimulate almost immediate regeneration. This lovely plant, which is called Hemanthes canaliculatus, is endangered, and it flowers profusely after a fire. In fact, I have several blooming in my garden right now. We've never had a fire in the garden either. A few famous plants like Mimetes cocatus above, Protea cineroides, the king Protea, Protea nitida on the bottom, have fire-resistant woody rootstock or stems, and soon resprout after a fire. Most seeds have evolved specifically to survive fire, and some actually require the chemicals in the smoke. From the ashes grow beautiful things. Example, this is a Hesias cinnamomea, an amaryllis that refuses to flower in cultivation. It only does so after a raging inferno has swept through its marshy habitat. One of the greatest flower shows ever is right here in the Cape, starting in August, when the West Coast erupts in a riot of colors, thanks to the arrival of the Namaqualand daisies. This unique display of nature is a sight as memorable as the lavender fields of Provence or the tulip fields of the Netherlands. This is the West Coast, north of Cape Town, and the landscape just erupts, depending on how much rain there's been that year. This past August, which is the start of our spring, was deemed to be the best show of flowers in living memory, thanks to the outstanding rains we had last winter, which thankfully overfilled our dams, assuring Capetonians that we were out of the dreaded drought, which created so much havoc in our daily lives just a few years ago. The flowers last a few short, weeks really, but only on sunny days as they open according to the sun. And it is truly an amazing thing to behold. This splendid sight of the spring flowers alone is a reason to come to this part of the world when international travel resumes. Now we're going to turn our attention to some cultivated gardens as opposed to the wilderness gardens that I have been showing you. And just like everything else here in Cape Town, there are some spectacular ones. I visit each of them, and many of you watching will recognize where we're going multiple times, and they are gardens which I hope will whet your appetite to come and visit once travel seems safe again. Welcome to gorgeous Stellenberg House and Gardens, which is located in the heart of Cape Town in a southern suburb called Kenilworth. This 18th century manor house is said to be one of the most beautiful in the Cape Peninsula, with a perfectly proportioned classic Cape Dutch facade. Since 1931, Stellenberg has had 3 owners who have cherished and improved the property. Professor C.F.M. Saint, who was the first chair of surgery at the University of Cape Town. Next, a man named Robin Stratford. And finally, the Ovenstone family, who acquired Stellenberg in the early 1950s. In the approximately 60 years that the Ovenstones have owned Stellenberg, it has remained in superlative condition. It's been described by historians and architects as one of the most beautiful Cape Dutch houses on the peninsula, with its balanced design, classical decoration, its wide, welcoming portal, and renowned gardens. Interestingly, the house has not been altered significantly since it was built in the 1740s. Stellenberg has played many roles during its long and interesting history, and today it is an internationally acclaimed 5-acre garden with old world dignity of elegantly manicured lawns and oak trees and many garden rooms. In its long past, it has been a farm dwelling, a manor house, a country retreat, a patrician residence, a heritage site, and today it is the family home of Andrew and Sandy Ovenstone. This sculpture, which is called Balance, is set on the upper lawn on the site previously occupied by Stellenberg's oldest English oak tree. This sculpture honors Madiba, our African name given to Nelson Mandela, with the inscription of his words, "After climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb." After Sandy, Andrew's wife, arrived at Stellenberg in 1973, she was content for a while with the inherited landscape of well-established lawns, trees, and shrubs. But over the next 14 years, she nurtured her growing passion by learning all she could about gardening, touring famous English gardens like Sissinghurst and Hidcote. In 1987, she created her first garden, the formal herb garden, in the shape of a cool green St. Andrew's cross, I'm sure named for her husband. On what was originally the tennis court, the English designer David Hicks designed a formal garden based on the classic idea of a walled garden to celebrate the 25th wedding anniversary of Andrew and Sandy Ovenstone in 1989. 30 years on, this iconic garden room at Stellenberg continues to honor the legacy and style of David Hicks while constantly evolving as the entire garden matures and changes. You can't really appreciate how big this space is that you're looking at. It's really enormous. And here is the immaculate kitchen garden with soil so rich, it's almost good enough to eat. This is the famous White Garden, possibly inspired by Vita Sackville West's White Garden at Sissinghurst in the United Kingdom. Undulating hedges of bloom, bursting with color and scent. This is definitely not an indigenous garden. And rightly so, as it represents its long history, which I think is a lovely thing and something to be preserved. This is the Garden of Reflection, which features 3 simple black pools to reflect the sky and is planted with an understated palette to encourage a feeling of quiet contemplation. Now we are going to leave Cape Town, and I am whisking you away to another famous garden. We are heading about an hour north to the famous winelands of the Cape, where we're going to see the garden of Una van de Spey, and it's called Old Nectar. And you can see that her house, now kept just as it always was, is very similar in design to the architecture of Stellenberg. Author of many books and plants and gardening, on plants and gardening, owner of the famous Old Nectar Homestead and Garden in Stellenbosch, Una van de Spey was the doyenne of the South African horticultural world. She wrote 20 books and countless publications. She was honored by one award after another, and even a rose was named after her. She was born in South Africa and she spent the early years of the war in London. Returning to her home in 1941, she and her husband, General K.R. van de Spey, bought the property, Old Nectar, an old Cape Dutch farmhouse with a few hectares of ground, in about 1941. As there was no garden, she immediately set about trying to create one worthy of the house, but she had no knowledge of plants when she started. Regardless, she succeeded admirably, as the garden in due course was declared a national monument, the only private garden to have been thus honored to date. And this picture was taken when Una was 97 years old. And here is that lovely rose named after her, the Una van de Spey. And it was a surprise gift to her, cultivated by the renowned Ludwig Tachner, founder of Ludwig's Roses, which is the largest grower of roses here in South Africa. From the 1950s onwards, she opened the garden each spring and raised millions of rands for various charities. Una van de Spey died 4 days before her 100th birthday on the 16th of July, 2012. Today, her three sons run the house and garden and keep her legacy alive. And in order to make it pay for itself, there is an entrance fee, and you can also rent the house, say for Christmas or a holiday. And it's furnished just as it was when Una was alive. This is a garden not so much of rooms, but of ideas that but of areas that one ambles to. There's a lot of shade, water, as well as sunshine, formal plantings, and then also areas on the wild side. Una really had it all at Old Nectar. Again, I would not call this an indigenous garden so much as a bursting English themed garden. She planted a number of trees in the 1940s, which today are enormous, adding shade, height, interest, and texture. It's a garden that has been cultivated continuously by one person from 1941 until she died in 2012, so over 70 years. Imagine the impact you could have on a garden for over 70 years. This is a very traditional garden, and it's in the areas like Stellenbosch, Franschhoek, and even Constantia in Cape Town. You can find this sort of big, traditional, almost blousy, old-fashioned English garden filled with clematis, digitalis, aquilegia, lilies, lavender, jasmine, and roses. These are the areas that do not get the debilitating wind, and also the soils are much richer than those gardens like mine, which are closer to the sea and very sandy. One of Una's passions was roses, and in late October, they are at their finest. This is my favorite part of her garden, the long arbor groaning with all sorts of roses with colorful, self-seeded perennials on either side. It's hard to adequately capture just how magnificent this long arbor is, and it is a delight every time. So we're going to leave Old Nectar and Una's legacy and visit a garden that is representative of indigenous plants in our floral kingdom. Welcome to the Dillon Lewis Sculpture Garden, also in the magnificent winelands near the university town of Stellenbosch. Phillip Lowes is a South African artist who has emerged as one of the foremost figures in contemporary sculpture, and his work features in private collections throughout the UK, Europe, the US, and Australia. His primary inspiration is wilderness. At one level, his bronze sculptures celebrate the power and movement of Africa's life forms. And at another, the textures he creates speak of the continent's primeval, rugged landscapes and their ancient rhythms. Phillip Lowes was born in 1964 and raised in an artistic family in South Africa. His father was an accomplished sculptor. His mother and his grandmother were painters, and two great-grandfathers were an architect and a cabinet maker, respectively. Lewis initially followed in the family tradition, beginning his career as a painter, but later turning to sculpture. In recent years, he has used the human figure to explore our relationship with our inner wildness, as he says. But Dillon Lewis is most famous for his big cats. This picture was taken from a very famous golf course called Leopard Creek. And this was to be his launching pad. He was asked to create a sculpture of a leopard for Johan Rupert, a very successful South African entrepreneur and businessman who owned Leopard Creek, which is near Kruger National Park. Rupert is estimated to be worth 5.9 billion US dollars as of 2019, and he ranked as the second wealthiest person in South Africa. The story goes that when Dillon Lewis thought about his commission of doing one leopard and realizing that there are 18 holes on a golf course, he suggested to Rupert that he create a series of sculptures portraying a day in the life of a leopard, one sculpture for every hole. And thus his own fame and fortune was made. So back to his own garden. Today, Dillon Lewis is South Africa's most famous living sculptor. Here's another example of his big cats. This picture was taken at the garden in 2016 when I first visited, and they are still probably what he's best known for, although his art has moved on considerably. And just notice the background, because the next picture I'm going to show you will illustrate how gardens evolve. Here's the same picture, but you can see that the fynbos has been clipped and sculpted to achieve a very serene, almost Japanese effect with spectacular mountains in the background. Everywhere you can walk, there are sculptures, and the landscape and sculpture are always changing. Initially, Dillon Lewis lived property and raised a family. It looked nothing like it does today. He became interested in physically shaping the landscape, and literally with earth moving machines that he drove himself, he sculpted the property, the actual dirt and earth, creating undulating hills and a large lake filled with water coming off the mountains. This, in many people's minds, is his finest work of sculpture, that of the creation of his own garden. These cats are lions, but mainly Dillon is known for his leopards. And there are bound to be leopards in those mountains. His garden is a 7-hectare property that Dillon describes as a wilderness. Made up of over 3 kilometers of pathways, the garden is covered in indigenous flora and dotted with approximately 60 of his sculptures. From his renowned works of animals and hybrids to his latest pieces focused on Rodin-inspired nudes. Now notice the figure in the background. Here's a better picture of it. A very Rodin-like man, doubled over with exertion and determination. Look at the mountains beyond and how magnificently they look as the natural backdrop to this piece, and really the entire garden. Now here you can see the dam or lake and several of his bigger pieces of sculpture on the left. One looking kind of like a chicken and the other an indeterminate animal. Could that be an anteater, maybe? Well, here's a better look. And no, it's not a donkey or an anteater. It's another leopard, headless and missing its 2 back forelegs. It nevertheless conveys movement and steely purpose as only leopards can. This anthropomorphic figure arises out of a sea of undulating shrubbery, the natural sculpture complementing the bronze beautifully. And here's another look at the lake, or the dam, as we say here in South Africa, and a closer look at that chicken. In the foreground, you can see red Protea and restios. And by the way, that is definitely not a chicken. But what is it? Well, it's a headless torso, minus arms and lower legs, and propped up on one hip. It is a fragment of a body, something that you see quite a bit of in this garden. Fragments which need your imagination to complete the picture. Once he was through moving the dirt around, he then needed to plant out his garden, and he knew nothing about plants or fynbos. So we hired one of the best landscapers in Cape Town, Francesca Watson, who used mainly indigenous plants to great effect. Now, I took this picture a few years ago when Dillon invited a few people to an evening tour. And today, this garden continues to expand and change, and I recommend it to anyone who comes to Cape Town as a most memorable day out in one of the most beautiful spots in our lovely floral kingdom. This enormous sculpture, by the way, is not a pretzel. It is another fragment of the human form. I have the pleasure of leading garden tours for our IWC club. And last year, in a small window of freedom, when lockdown lifted, I organized a garden tour in November to a private home in Constantia, one of Cape Town's most beautiful and illustrious suburbs. This was a huge garden to complement a very contemporary and enormous house perched on a hill just under Table Mountain. Here's the house, only a few years old, and as I said, really large. We have a design ethic here in South Africa, which is fascinating and varied, encompassing the vernacular Cape Dutch, which we saw at Stellenberg and Old Nectar, as well as the extremely modern, perhaps because of the light, the space, and the sunshine. Very contemporary designs, such as this, hold a certain appeal, even to those of us who consider ourselves traditionalists. And the garden of this house was extraordinary. It had everything in a most natural setting. It was only about, I'd say, 3 years old as well. There were paths, fynbos, sculpture, vegetable garden, and more. The square seating area, or boma, is a fire pit. So you can see that in the middle there is a square table-like thing, which we call a boma. And in the foreground is a protea, and you can see mainly fynbos in this picture, giving the garden a sort of a wild but diverse feel. What a small world. Here's a Dillon Lewis sculpture plonked in the middle of this very indigenous garden and looking fabulous. I included pictures of this garden because I wanted you to see that many of us use what grows naturally in our floral kingdom as foundation plants. Here we see red and yellow pincushions, or leucospurnum. I just love this natural piece of sculpture, an old tree trunk, but placed with such effect in the middle of indigenous plants. My takeaway that day we toured this garden was that some of my indigenous shrubs in my own garden can be turned into clipped topiary. Here's another example of clipping and snipping, which I love, and it's reminiscent of a knot garden. I think this is beautiful. Our visit to this garden was magical, and it just underscored what can happen in only a few years with determination and imagination. Before I leave you, I'd like to say thank you to all my Cape Town IWC friends, and a big thank you to those of you from Sweden who could join us today. This is truly international cooperation and friendship at its best, and we hope to continue joint programs. As a reminder of how lovely our part of the world is, this is a view of Walker Bay, which is near Hermanus, from a marvelous place that my husband and I stayed at called Klootbos. And we are looking down upon fynbos at its best. That is all I need to say. So let me reiterate how grateful I am for the chance to talk to you today about the wonderful country we live in and its amazing horticultural heritage. Come and visit South Africa when you can, and thank you all, and I hope to see you again.